So starting our second session, Gender in the Diplomatic Practice. For this session, I am delighted to welcome to stage Professor of Government at GUQ, Dr. Mehran Kamrava as moderator. Assistant Secretary General of NATO and former Canadian High Commissioner to Pakistan, Ambassador Wendy Gilmour. Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy at Georgetown in DC, former Ambassador to the US to the Netherlands, Ambassador Cynthia Schneider. EU Ambassador to Qatar, His Excellency Cristian Tudor.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure and an honor spending the next 45 minutes or hour and 15 minutes rather with you. It's terrific being here, and it's a particular pleasure being on the same panel as our distinguished panelists. Cristian and Cynthia have been good old friends, and I'm thrilled to also meet Her Excellency Wendy Gilmour. It's a pleasure. Their biographies, if I were to go through them, we would be here all afternoon. So you can scan them. They're on the program, and I won't take time explaining their biographies, going through them. But suffice it to say, as you can see for yourselves, they're all extremely distinguished and have had wonderful careers. So, without further ado, why don't we start with a few comments by each of you on where you see things and how you see women's position in diplomacy from your vantage point, given your own unique experiences, and then we'll go to some questions. Your Excellency?
Wendy works just fine. But it's
Your Excellency Wendy.
That's fine.
Wendy, please go right ahead.
I'll start off.
Thank you.
But first of all, thank you very much to our wonderful moderator, my fellow panelists, but also to Georgetown University here in Qatar for the opportunity to come and to be part of this gathering. And I was thrilled to get the invitation and to be able to respond to my good friend, Her Excellency Andrula Kamanara. Because we had a very interesting experience together as diplomats, as heads of mission in Pakistan, which is a diplomatic corps in which there were very few women that were heads of mission. I think there were 5 or 6 of us out of a diplomatic corps of 90 plus when we were there. And what it really did reinforce to me is, number one, representation matters, that having women in leadership roles gives an opportunity for not only host governments and interlocutors to understand that diversity is important and can engage, but also to have role models for young women and girls that are looking to see what might be possible by way of professional opportunity. It also reinforced to me the importance of networks and contacts, and having a strong network of women provides a different opportunity to bounce ideas and to move things forward. And that's, I think, been one of the things over the course of my career, which is now 34 years in the Foreign Service and the Canadian government, that really leaning on colleagues, finding champions of change, finding the advocates that you need within a system is one of the most effective ways of having your voice heard. And I'd say I was going to, I know we want to limit our opening remarks, but I was going to say just a few words of what, in my own experience, being one of very few, being a woman in non-traditional roles has meant. And it's interesting, it is sort of, just in terms of how recent the history is. Andrula at the very beginning said that, she thought when starting her career that she would not be at the end of her career still thinking that we have to advocate for gender diversity in leadership positions. But it actually has been only a limited period of time. The first Canadian head of mission, the first Canadian ambassador that was a woman, was only in 1958. And it was another 15 years before the second one was appointed. The first woman to be posted abroad who was married, that had her husband along with her, was only in the 1970s. The first woman, this is in the Canadian Foreign Service, to be allowed to take a maternity leave while on post, while posted abroad, was only in the 1980s. And, when you start thinking of it in terms of that, that's a very recent period of time that we have managed to break through some of the barriers to normalize having women in these roles, that it is important that we keep talking about it and we keep advocating for it. And particularly across the world where the experience of women in leadership roles can be very different. I mean, being in Pakistan, I was always reminded that the first woman leader, woman head of government in an Islamic country was in Pakistan. And, as a role model for not only for the Islamic world, but of course also for the rest of the world, to have a woman in leadership positions, so tremendously important. And one of the things I hope we'll talk about a little bit more on the panel is, frankly, how we address the challenges that women face uniquely, but also other underrepresented groups face by way of unconscious bias, and how to address that, to understand how to capitalize on what makes diverse and unique experiences be able to multiply. What is the multiplying factor that allows the advocacy to take more root? And often I believe women and other unrepresented groups in leadership positions have more of an opportunity to make their voices heard because they are unique, because they are the first. But then how do you make that then carry forward? So with that, I'll stop, but thank you very much. And
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cynthia?
Thank you so much, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is such a pleasure to be back in Doha and back at Georgetown, Qatar, both places I've visited quite frequently since I first came to Doha in 2007 with the Brookings Institution's U.S. Islamic World Forum. I'm going to talk from my experience as ambassador to the Netherlands, which was some time ago, but I hope I can deduce it was 1998 to 2001. I hope I can pull out some lessons from that will still be useful today. I'll tell you quite honestly, I was surprised at the degree to which gender was a factor from the very beginning. And as I assumed that post, I was surprised to find myself in gatherings of 25 people with 3 women, and all the rest were men, 50 people and 5 women, 100 people and maybe 10 women. I thought, what is going on here? And because I hadn't had that kind of experience in the United States, although goodness knows we have a long way to go there also. And it was an encounter with a Dutch executive, someone from the private sector, that kind of clued me in as to what was happening. I happened to meet that then CEO of Heineken at a reception within the first year of my time in Holland. And he came up and introduced himself to me and said, hello, I understand that you have children. And I said, yes, I have 2 children. And he said, what have you done with them while you are ambassador? And I was so stunned by this question. I said, well, I've left them in a closet in the United States, and I'm going to take them out in 3 years. And I could see just for a nanosecond, he was thinking, how big is that closet? And who's feeding them in that closet? How are they going to school in that closet? Then, of course, he realized I was joking, and then treated me to a quite lengthy lecture on Dutch family values and how they felt the woman should be raising the children and keeping the home. This was something I was very familiar with, but because I came to the position from Georgetown University, where at that point I was teaching art history, and I specialized in 17th century Dutch art. So I was very familiar with the value placed on the woman as the head of the household in 17th century Holland, when it was very modern. They were the first republic. Women had financial ownership of the household. They were powerful in many ways. Slightly less modern in the 20th century. But I hasten to add that this didn't affect in any way how I was able to do the job. And despite that kind of environment, I followed my own gut instincts, which were to emphasize culture, because I came from a background as an art historian. And that was really where my knowledge was. Of course, we had the Kosovo War, the indictment of Milosevic, a COP6 meeting, many, many things that were pure policy issues. But in my discretionary time and the way I built relationships, I used culture, which may be more associated with women than men. I don't know. And I'll just give you a flavor of two things, and then I'm happy to elaborate in questions. But I built a relationship with the Dutch military that was very strong, that began with a joint viewing of the film Saving Private Ryan, followed by a very deep, very personal conversation between my military staff and the Dutch Joint Chiefs of Staff. I also ran a half marathon on an Air Force base. I flew in an F-16 without throwing up. But I continued and I jogged every week with the head of the Air Force. So I built personal relationships. But towards the end of my tenure, I orchestrated a meeting between the number 2 person in the Pentagon and his counterpoint in the Netherlands. And this meeting involved an organ concert, a private organ concert, and a tour of a historic town. And at the end of it, the Dutch became the first country in Europe to buy into the Joint Strike Fighter, which was the mission I had been given by the Pentagon at the beginning of the year, as every American ambassador in Europe was. They became the first, and other countries followed, earning me, to my surprise, I didn't even know it existed, the highest civilian award that the Pentagon gives. They hadn't given it to an ambassador in 12 years, and they gave me a great citation which basically said, whoever would have thought an art historian would be so good at selling weapons? But that was, I think, for one very simple reason. I approached that task, as I did every task, with the simplest idea. You're dealing with human beings. And how do you get to know those human beings? And how do you build a relationship of mutual trust? Because in my view, that's really what diplomacy is. You can't get anywhere without mutual trust. So I use culture quite a lot, also in the area of drug interdiction, which I can answer questions about later if people are interested. I'll add one more thing, building on what Wendy said about networks. Something that was really important for me when I was ambassador was our incredible network of other female ambassadors serving in the Netherlands. We had about 12 of us, plus we met with the 4 Dutch female ministers who were very important and had very important positions. The female ambassadors serving in the Netherlands came from all over the world: Oman, Tunisia, Ghana, Nigeria, plus England, Canada, and France. And we would meet about once a month. We talked about, the work and the country, but we talked a lot about our lives and how we tried, I hate that word balance, work-life balance. I don't think it exists, but how we tried to manage the two and the different experiences we had in different parts of the world. And we built this incredibly strong bond. Earlier, the former president of Lithuania talked about kind of building a wall around herself. I don't think this was a wall, but I felt it was kind of the battalion I had with me in that country, these other wonderful women who I learned so much from. And we talked a lot about the importance of mentorship and passing on this sense of solidarity to younger women and helping younger women. And of course, this network could also be useful. And I will give just one example. When the CEO of an American pharmaceutical company came to me with real challenges trying to get a cancer drug on the market in the Netherlands. It was already being used in the United States, and I knew from doctors, I knew that they really wanted it in the Netherlands, but it was kind of blocked in the regulatory process. And he said to me, I have tried everything. I can't get this thing moving. And I said, well, let me see what I can do. And of course, Els Borst, the Minister of Health, was part of our group. So I was able to get right through to her, and she was able to look into it and find out what the problem was and get this drug moving so that Dutch people could use it. So I would say, just in closing, I often talk about when you're in the position of leadership, which academics rarely are. This is one time I was. Don't check your personality at the door. Do you follow your heart and your gut of what you think you can do? And as Wendy said already, build networks with other women and support those coming up behind you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Cristian?
Thank you very much, Mehran. Thank you, and good morning. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to thank Georgetown for organizing this important event. Thank you, Mehran, for inviting me. I represent the European Union in Qatar, and this is a newly established delegation, diplomatic mission. I'm a Romanian citizen. I've worked before in Qatar as the ambassador of Romania. But before going into more of a factual presentation, to share with you what the European Union has been doing specifically when it comes to gender in diplomatic practice. I come from Romania, and my mother is a very strong woman and a famous one in Romania. She is our first war reporter. So in the 90s, she has been traveling to all the hot spots in the world, and she continued to do so. And then she taught journalism at the university. So I come from a family where my mother she's been very strong. 2 points. I noticed that for her it was more difficult to get in a lot of breakthroughs, but I was used to that. So sometimes we coming from Europe, sometimes when we talk about gender, we look at it as a given, and for us it's let's say a natural sort of factor and fact. It's in the society. Women are appointed. We see women in leadership positions in the EU, but I don't think that it's a given, and I think that we should continue to talk about it. And I think my colleague, the South African ambassador, referred to this using a very good metaphor, like riding the bicycle, and I think it's important to continue to talk about it because it's still an issue in the sense that we have not reached gender parity, at least in the EU. So I'd like just to give you a few factual points of the progress that we have achieved. For instance, 47 of senior managers in the European Commission, 31% of the European External Action Service senior managers, 37 in the diplomatic missions abroad, in the delegations, and 28% in our civilian CSDP missions were women. For the middle management, the figures were 47.9% for the Commission and 41% for the External Action Service. We have not reached yet an equal representation of the genders, but we have witnessed a serious and substantial progress in the last 5 years. There are a few, I would say, landmarks that I would like to refer to. In 2010, the European Union introduced the Gender Action Plan, which aims to strengthen the leading role of the EU in promoting gender equality and women empowerment through a transformative approach. But what's important to be referred to is the fact that the European Union made gender equality and women empowerment a cross-cutting priority of the EU external action. In policy, in programming work, meaning how we disperse our funds for development aid and for cooperation. We monitor, we evaluate, assess ourselves to deliver on that promise. I mean, on a broad spectrum, another landmark decision, I think that's very important, was the fact that we appointed an EU ambassador on gender and diversity, who aims at fully integrating and mainstreaming the gender equality and women empowerment into all EU's analysis and responses to challenges, crises, and conflicts, as well as to the EU's contribution to rules-based multilateralism, and will the outcome be sustainable and will respond to the expectations of our changing societies. The European External Action Service, since its inception and more actively in the last few years, has promoted gender equality and in diplomacy, and it brings a multitude of benefits. It leads to more balanced and inclusive policies, fosters greater understanding and empathy, while it strengthens the EU's credibility as a champion of human rights and equality on the global stage. We cherish the fact that we have come a long way, but at the same time we recognize the challenges and obstacles that still persist. Stereotypes, unconscious bias, and structural inequalities continue to limit women's participation and advancement in diplomatic careers globally and within the European Union. However, we do not shy away from discussing these issues, and on the contrary, we are very transparent about it, and in our goals, in our policies, and the hurdles that we have to overcome. In this context, I'm very happy to be here and to engage with you all in a discussion of this very important topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cristian. That was terrific. My thanks to all three of you. Let me start with a couple of questions, and for our audience members, you can submit your questions through the QR code, and if you scan it, you can submit it, and I'll receive them. Wendy, let me start with you. You were Assistant Secretary General of NATO, and also spent a considerable amount of time in the Canadian Foreign Service. What were the main differences in terms of organizational cultures of how women were treated in each of these organizations?
And thank you for the question. It's an interesting one to reflect on, because really what I found when I went to NATO as the Assistant Secretary General for defense investment was my portfolio. And that is the area that works with governments, the member states of NATO, to try and encourage interoperability and to develop military capabilities. So it tends to be the community of armaments directors, is what it's called, the Conference of National Armaments Directors. It tends to be engineering and material background, which is not only is the military a non-traditional area for women, but the engineering and equipment areas are even more so non-traditional areas for women. So when I was coming from the Canadian Foreign Service, while we have not achieved gender parity across the Foreign Service, we have now achieved gender parity in heads of mission, which was a deliberate decision by the Government of Canada in 2015. I was used to seeing more women faces at the table. I mean, you mentioned the sort of being the few women in the room. When I got to NATO, I was shocked to find out how few women were actually there. But it makes sense. It is a military organization. It's a strategic level headquarters. So the women that are sitting, those few that are around the table, the men that are sitting around the table, either in uniform or in civilian clothes, started their career about the same time I did, in the early 1990s, the late 1980s, when we were underrepresented as part of overall engagements. But it is still shocking in a European sense to go to an organization. I mean, I have photographs of meetings that I chaired where I was the only woman in the picture. And just as an anecdote, when I was in Pakistan, because of Canada's feminist foreign policy, because of our engagement globally, I was constantly promoting access for women into decision-making spaces and being fairly vocal about it. When I got to NATO and I put up a photo on Twitter, or X or whatever it's called right now, of me and my community with the only woman in the room, I got trolled by all my former contacts in Pakistan saying, hey, you told us that Pakistan has a problem with women's representation. What about NATO? And they were absolutely right. But the challenge is developing the leadership and the path to these positions from a relatively early age. And what disturbs me more than anything is that when I look at the junior officer cadre, civilian and military, in countries across the world, but particularly in NATO, I'm not seeing the representation of women right now that are then going to become the leaders in 15 and 20 years. And that's really where we have to put our effort. And that's one of the things we tried to do in NATO, and it didn't always work. So, I mean, there are issues with gender representation globally. It is not something which is specific to the term the Global South. It's not specific to countries that have more traditional or conservative societies. It's everywhere, and the nature of access to decision-making space is something that we all have to advocate for.
Perfect, thank you. Cynthia, you are, as you mentioned, one of those few people who have traversed academia and diplomacy. And how's the issue of gender handled in each of these? Is it different in university environment or academic environment versus in diplomacy, or are there parallels?
Thank you for that question, Mehran. I'm going to have to think about it a little bit. I am not sure that it's that different, unfortunately. I think there are challenges in having a sufficient number of women at the top in both fields. What I detected, though, something I will say was different in the State Department, and I was only there for 3 years, so my impression could be wrong, but it's a very hierarchical organization. And I think the organization does not serve its members very well, because in my experience, the State Department is full of brilliant people and innovative thinkers who are a little crushed by the system in which they work. And that's not a huge amount of rewards for out-of-the-box thinking. That's different from academia. I think there's more room for flexibility in thinking in academia. And again, I'm just going to mention culture a little bit. I've quickly found that the idea of integrating culture into your diplomacy, and I don't mean having an American this or that come perform, I mean looking at the culture of the country and actually putting that at the heart of what you're doing. People in the State Department thought that was crazy and completely unimportant, and why would anyone serious ever do anything like that? It's very political security oriented. It's hard to break out of that. Luckily, I was in charge, and so I did, and people could see how effective this could be. But I'm not under any illusion that broke the mold in the State Department. I just want to mention one other thing that is different between the two, I think. The United States State Department has had, since the time that Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, an office of the Women's Affairs that promotes women's affairs around the world. And we have at Georgetown the Center for Women, Peace, and Security, founded by Milan Verveer, who was the first person who held that office. And Milan does extraordinary work at Georgetown, convening women leaders from all over the world. I think a challenge that you have with having this position in the State Department is, in diplomacy and international affairs, you are rightly judged by what you do. And I think, this is my own personal view, this is not a Georgetown view, this is not a State Department view, but after the U.S. withdrawal in Afghanistan, after what we have left women in Afghanistan to face, it's difficult for the United States to talk about standing for women's rights.
We'll come to, yep, definitely. We'll come to women and conflict in a minute, but you mentioned something important, which is women in bureaucracies. And we know bureaucracies have their own particular and often quite rigid and conformist organizational culture. So given that there have been 2 female secretaries of state in the United States, and this is to the both of you. 3, yes.
Condoleezza Rice.
I apologize. Yes, Condoleezza Rice, I forgot, yes. I'm trying to prevent the Bush years out of my mind, but yes, the G.W. Bush years, yes.
That wouldn't be my top years to keep out of my mind, but anyway, I think there's a good contender.
So how does that trickle down through the organization in terms of kind of creating a robust organizational culture? Wendy, you referred to Canada's feminist foreign policy. Now, how is that feminist foreign policy implemented in a way that doesn't undermine the position of women, so that when you see a woman head of mission, you don't say, oh, well, Canada has a quota system? And
so the answer on how do we implement a feminist foreign policy is fairly simple. It's one in which we have a stated policy, part of our procedure, to provide for a gender-based analysis of all of our policies and programs, which means that when a document or a proposal goes up to government for a decision, we are required to look at that proposal in light of the diverse impact that it might have, or the impact it might have on diverse communities. And that's important. And I mean, if you look, and I know we're going to talk about conflict at a different time, but if you look at how conflict impacts populations in different countries, disproportionately conflict impacts women and girls. It's, climate change disproportionately impacts women and girls, because if you look at what type of household tasks are required, access to basic items like water, for example, the ability of an individual to migrate is hampered if they are, responsible for household tasks, which tend to be disproportionately women. I mean, that's just one example. I won't go on too much at length, but very quickly, a gender-based analysis in domestic policy. There was an example in Canada, it's hard to think about in a Qatar context about snow and ice, but the city of Ottawa, our capital, did a gender-based impact of something as simple as snow clearing operations, and determined that a higher proportion of women traveling to work used public transport, higher proportion of men drove their own vehicles. And yet the snow clearance operations were prioritizing roads and not sidewalks and access to public transport. So by doing that type of analysis, it changed the approach to actually a very pragmatic impact on the ground. So it's something where, unless we are conscious about assessing a policy's impact on gender, but also extending to other diverse populations, whether it's ethnic minorities, religious minorities, disenfranchised communities, we're never going to really realize what that policy's impact is going to have. But very quickly, with respect to the quota, I heard one of my former colleagues, who was the champion for the Women's Network in Foreign Affairs, saying, well, it was 100% quota for men up until a certain time, so the fact that it's only 50% for women is actually not that big of a quota. And what is absolutely crucial in all of these elements is understanding that the population from which you are choosing is qualified. They all have similar qualifications. They all have had equal opportunity. They all have equal ability to contribute. And the fact that we are now identifying people from underrepresented groups to make that contribution is what is going to make ultimately our foreign policy more effective.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm just going to pick up a little bit on quotas because I wanted to also defend quotas. I think we can all agree that we want qualified people in positions. That is an uncontroversial statement, but I hope we can all recognize that people outside the majority group are not as likely to get there, to have that opportunity without quotas, and we need them. And I will give you an example, again referring to Afghanistan, of an incredibly successful quota, which has of course been completely blown up now. But under President Bush, the United States imposed on Afghanistan a quota of 25% of the parliament had to be women. Now, you might say that really takes some gall considering that we didn't meet that quota in the United States. But that didn't stop us, and it was achieved in Afghanistan. Not only that, it was exceeded. And those are some of the most extraordinary women in the world today. Some of them are still in Afghanistan. Many of them are out, actually thanks to Milan Verveer, who I mentioned, who got 1,000 women out. But without that quota, that never would have happened. So I do think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And in terms of the women's leadership trickling down, I'm going to say that that's really the personality of the leader, male or female. Hillary Clinton was a famously engaged Secretary of State who really drew on the knowledge and expertise of the career Foreign Service officer. She always made sure that the desk officer of the country or region she was going to visit was present at all the briefings and gave that person the floor. That did an incredible amount to build morale and to kind of break through that strict hierarchy. Colin Powell did the same thing. So I think it's really more a question of personality than gender.
Right. Cristian, to say that there are conflicts and tensions around us is an understatement. You've been ambassador to Qatar, Romania's ambassador to Qatar, Romania's ambassador to Kuwait, EU ambassador now, career diplomat. In your experience, how have you seen the impact of conflict differ on men and women in different parts of the world?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so obviously I've been working in the Middle East and on the Middle East for the last 21 years in various roles, and I've seen the impact of conflict all around. And I served in Syria during when the crisis and then the war started there. I was EU ambassador in Kuwait and now here, and it's and I'm very happy to be here to listen to all these thoughts and because I've seen, for instance, this change of how the role of women in the Romanian diplomatic service, which is not as sophisticated as the EU's ones, where there's a clear political decision to bridge a gap, and then there's commitment, and there's a gender parity policy that is really pursued, and I am very, and by the way, I support personally the quotas, and I think this is absolutely essential to bridge that gap. But coming back to conflict, obviously, and we see this all around us, women and children are more impacted by conflict. So hence it's very important to integrate gender in the policies at all aspects, at all levels, and that is what the European Union has been doing on many fronts and at all levels, and also through the collaboration of the member states that are obviously engaged in this. I know that since the EU has been supporting the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on WPS. That's I know that there are policies targeting this and conflict, and it's obviously and all around us. And as we speak about it these days, we know very well how sensitive the regional situation is, and we see in Gaza like it's pretty clear that women and children are much more impacted by that, definitely.
Yeah. And on the other side, are women included in peace negotiations?
I think that's something also very important, and I'm sure my colleague Rafaela Iodice, who is our head of mission in Afghanistan, because right now we have a diplomatic mission functional there, will be able to speak about that with concrete details. But I don't think that women are included as much as it should be. It ought to be. Gender aspect is important because throughout my experience, I've seen how important it is to work with women, and I've seen the added value of that, because it's not only about bridging gaps and making sure that it's a 50-50. But it's about the diversity as well in the decision-making process, but also when you have women in negotiating teams, that brings added value. It helps bridging the gap. It helps reaching consensus. And the reality of the situation is that we do not have that as much as we should. I don't think we do have that in negotiations on Gaza right now. But I know that for instance, on issues related to humanitarian aid, development cooperation, we have women more and more involved in these efforts, but not as much as it ought to be.
Yeah, go ahead.
On that, you mentioned 1325, the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace and security. It had as one of its explicit goals to increase the number of women in negotiations process in conflict situations. There was a recent study done, and it's still only about 10% of negotiations have a woman included. And I come back to, it's not just gender, it's diversity of representation across the board, which makes any negotiating team, any decision-making team, that much more effective. I mean, if you translate that into the corporate and the business world, there's now many nations, but increasing effort to try and increase the diversity of board members. And there's been there was one by the London School of Economics that determined that boards that have at least 1/3 of their members that are women are something in the range of 20 to 30% more profitable than corporations that don't have that diversity of board. And you need to avoid groupthink in any situation. You need the opportunity to think outside of the box, to understand how decisions are going to impact, coming back to gender-based analysis, how decisions are going to impact a wider variety of people in order to make better decisions. And I was very struck. I had the privilege of being in Afghanistan for a certain period of time and working at that time as a civilian with the military, and realizing that all of my colleagues that were in uniform, they were all male. They were not able to engage with, at that moment, it was in the early 2000s, engage with and talk to women in the Afghan society. But I could, and I was able to understand sort of what were the motivation, or try to understand the motivations, the interests, and bring that back into the room and advocate for women to be represented in engagements and in decision-making spaces. And it's not always, and it's important to remember, and as I think, as you mentioned, women aren't there necessarily just to advocate for, quote, women's issues or family issues. They're there to advocate for decision-making across the range of activities and across the range of issues that are going to fundamentally contribute to a better outcome, whether it's in a peace negotiation, in a trade negotiation, or whatever it happens to be, which is why we need women represented at all levels. tonight.
I want
Absolutely.
to pick up on a couple of things. Well, they said, first of all, on the feminist foreign policy, I want to say that the Netherlands recently has signed on to be one of the 10 countries with a feminist foreign policy. So keep that in mind as well, which of course the United States has not. And then you mentioned corporate boards. I can give a personal example of how I, as the only woman on a board, but I think this would be true of anyone who's like a different ethnic group, just someone who's different from the rest of the group. I was put on the corporate board of Ahold, a very large food company. They own Giant and Stop and Shop in the U.S. Right after I left the ambassadorship, and I was the only woman on the outside corporate board and the management board. I came unburdened by any financial or business knowledge. A lot of knowledge of the Netherlands, but and grocery stores, I suppose, but not a great deal of finance, which I studied as much as I could before I went to the first meeting. But what I noticed right away was this incredible groupthink. And these were all men, different parts of Europe, but all white men from the same class and the same background. They played golf together, you know, everything you'd think. And I was stunned to listen to these presentations where they would say, well, we've bought this company for X. We were expecting a revenue of 3X. We got a revenue of a third X. And then we bought this company. I'd be going, wait, what happened there? What's the explanation? What are we doing about that? And they all would look at me like I was the worst pariah. You know, why are you asking a question? We're in the meeting. We just listened to presentations. Then nobody ever asked a question. And I kept asking questions, and I got more and more annoyed. And then finally, people began to look more carefully at what was going on, also the whole process of the meetings. Because we had the inside management and outside management in the same meeting. So you can't ever have a conversation about what's going on because the people you were talking about are right there. So I first had to get them to pull out, which was a whole big deal. And then everyone said, gee, that was a really good idea. But I didn't know all that was going on. I don't pretend to at all. But within 8 months of the time I joined the board, the company had completely imploded. The CEO was fired, the CFO was fired, the SEC was investigating, the CFO went to jail, the stock price completely plummeted. I mean, no one knew how bad things were. But by questioning at all, which no one was doing, at least we were a little more prepared.
Thank you. I'm a little stunned at the implosion of the company, but
Yeah. So were the stockholders.
I can imagine. There's a question from the audience for both Wendy and Cynthia. So as ambassadors, as people who are engaged with a global community, how do you deal with circumstances and situations in which there are people who have different ideas and values about gender and still hold on to your own values but are able to engage in dialogue with them?
I mean, I can
Go ahead.
first.
Go.
I have been confronted. It's with unconscious bias, where people are making assumptions but not necessarily aware that they're making those assumptions. And I have been confronted by conscious bias. I can remember sitting, and I won't name the place or the country or the individual, but sitting in a room with a minister of a foreign government, and that minister telling me that in his country, he would never allow me, their person, to be a woman, but it was okay because I was a foreigner.
Yeah.
And I realized that there was, in fact, in some societies, this concept of, another third gender, which was the international woman. And it really made me realize the position of privilege that I occupied in trying to advocate for issues and cultures where I had access to opportunities, to dialogue, to express my views that local members of that population, women or men, were not able to do so at all. And that frankly added a sense of responsibility on my side to make myself heard. I was also in a situation very early in my career. I started off as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces in the 1980s when women were still restricted to certain jobs in the forces. I could be an administrative officer, I could be a transport officer, I could be a finance officer. I have to say trucks sounded like the most fun, and so I went for transport. And I had a boss who said, Wendy, when I work with you, and he meant it as a compliment, I forget that you're a woman. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that means to you what it means to me. Yay, you think that I'm doing, but in his mind, I was behaving in a way that did not emphasize my gender, which in fact was a little bit I made a point thereafter to sort of emphasize it because I wanted to make sure that there was a representation that was there. But it is, it isn't just gender. I maybe the last thing I would say is I had the very good fortune, my very first posting was in Southern Africa. I was in Zimbabwe before the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I encountered in engagement both with South Africans, I was down in Pretoria for a period of time, but also in Zimbabwe with people that had been part of the former Rhodesian regime that were out and out racist in a way that I found completely shocking that somebody would have the temerity to express those views directly. I mean, again, in the conscious versus unconscious bias. And I felt that it was both my role to address it, not to let anything go by, but to figure out a way in which to do so that was not directly threatening. I needed to have a dialogue with these people, and I needed to try and ensure that I understood their perspective while at the same time in no way ever condoning it. And that was a very difficult for a balance to find, especially as a junior diplomat, but one in which in a foreign service career, but frankly in any career, in business or wherever else, you're always going to be confronted by people that hold different views. And the key is, and I think it's the relationships that you mentioned earlier, finding a way to connect with people in a way that they find non-threatening, but at the same time not in any way compromising your values.
Yeah, I can pick up on that and just say I've also had that experience in all over the Middle East and Central and Southeast Asia of being the international woman. It is a privileged position, and you don't really have so much a sense of what life is like for other people there. Bizarrely, again, I'm afraid my most contentious times around this issue were in the Netherlands, and I don't think I handled it very well because I was quite honestly so kind of upset to see the kind of bias that even there I was not an international woman. I was just a woman who bizarrely was working even though she had children. So I got a lot of these attitudes, and I felt kind of compelled to talk about it, which was very appreciated by Dutch women, particularly young women. But looking back on it, that was not my place. So I don't think I handled it as well as I might have. And I think after my time in Ahold, where there were so many funny stories, I won't tell you all of them, but I learned to accept that, there's some people you're never going to change, and find another way to effect change. I'll just give you one example. After everything imploded at Ahold, we were having a meeting before 600 angry shareholders who, of course, wanted to get rid of the board, but everyone else was gone, so we were kind of saying, you better keep us at least for a little bit, otherwise there's literally no one running this company. This was a meeting that went on for like 4 hours. These are 600 angry people. This is a food company. And guess what was not served? Not a morsel. That was, I think, not a woman in charge of that. But so we're having to justify why each of us should stay on the board through the end of our term. And the CEO, who if you can believe it, was the next the head of the board, who you can believe it was the next CEO of Heineken. I don't know what it is with that company, but he's going down explaining why everyone should stay on the board, and this is the CEO of Unilever, this is the CEO of Shell, and blah blah blah, everybody. And he comes to me and he says, Mrs. Schneider, doctor, professor, ambassador, but no, Mrs. Schneider, pause, will add a feminine touch to the boards. That's what the 600 angry shareholders got. They were so mad. Luckily, that didn't seem to make an impact. And I was just sitting there going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I'm furiously writing things on my steno pad, and then I stopped. And I thought, I'm never going to change this man. This is just how he is. So instead, I put myself on the nominations committee. And by the time I did step down at the end of my term, we had a majority number of women on the board, extraordinary leaders. And there's where the lasting impact was. No.
Perfect. Thank you. Cristian, but by the way, lots of questions are coming in, and I'll try to get through to as many of them as possible. So this is another question from the audience. Given that you've spent all of your career so far in diplomacy, in terms of political accountability, are men and women held to the same standards, or do they get the same level and the same kind of criticism?
Well, that's an interesting question. Thank you. I think they should be, when it comes to political accountability and when it comes to streamlining. So I have not seen, at least in my career, this, let's say, bias in action, or I think that the whole idea would be to streamline this. So to look at it from a let's say also from a meritocracy perspective, in the sense that you have men and women occupying temporarily certain leadership positions, and when you have the political accountability, that is a reflection or a consequence of an action or an inaction, of a success or of a failure. So I have not seen that, but I can understand where this question comes from. I do believe, just to pivot back to the discussion, that the change is possible, and we see that throughout our careers, very difficult to effect change and very difficult to. And I've seen that also from my perspective, but I think the whole idea is to continue to push in that direction and to continue to use different other means to get to those individuals who are very much stuck into that. Hence the awareness, hence the need to engage, and also using more creative ways to get to those individuals. That is something that we do. For instance, I'm trying to do when I work on gender and diversity as well, especially in more traditional areas, to put it this way. So to sum up, I have not seen a distinction or a differentiation when it comes to political accountability, and I think that's a good thing.
Perfect. When?
I would say just a few. The standard to which all individuals should be held should be the same, but we have to understand, and I know I'm speaking to an academic audience, and there are sociologists in the room, that the perceptions can be very different. If you look at an individual performance level, and this in a nomination committee, this can be very, very important. The language that's used to describe women leaders, and often other represented groups, can be very different. If a woman is described as ambitious, it's perceived as negative, not a positive. Whereas if a man is described as ambitious, it's a positive. If a woman is described as aggressively pursuing an issue, it's a negative. Whereas a man in the same situation would be demonstrating leadership. These are the types of things why, frankly, doing the training on unconscious bias is really important. At one of the jobs that I did at NATO, in addition to my position as an ASG, an Assistant Secretary General, is I sat on the committee that looked at promotions and performance. And I was shocked to look at how often the language in performance assessments was perceived differently for the women candidates than for the men. women candidates for senior positions were often described as not displaying the necessary leadership acumen, which simply meant that for the majority of the panel that was assessing them, they could not envisage the woman candidate in the role that had traditionally been occupied, I don't know, maybe by the male gray-haired man. And that's where, and it was very useful. And one of the things I insisted on is that panel, we actually did an unconscious bias course before assessing sort of the next year's worth of performance assessments, because I was so shocked at how often these issues were coming up. And it wasn't just the men who were identifying them, it was also the women in the room who were not picking up on these cues that actually were putting very qualified women candidates at a disadvantage compared to their male counterparts.
Interesting. Wendy, I'm going to come to you for the next question.
I'll make my answer shorter.
Yes, thank you so much, because we want to get through all of them, and we only have a few more minutes. Given your time in Pakistan, that's why I'm coming to you with this question. Isn't the Global South in some ways a model, the question asks, particularly since South Asia has had more women as heads of state and appointed women to high posts in diplomatic missions?
I wouldn't say that it's a model. I would say that there is still a lot of progress across the globe that's required. Certainly, if we look at the case of Pakistan specifically, they have had one woman head of government. She was initially appointed into the opportunity, or become the prime minister by virtue of family connection. So she came there by, from, and this is, not just for women, but across the board in Pakistan, it still is a very a captive elite and sort of ruling families that get opportunities for these positions. So that certainly creates the example of a woman leader, but what we need to see is more democratization of women coming up uniquely into the opportunity as opposed to there because of familial connections. The number of women heads of mission from the Global South, frankly, is about the same proportion in some instances as those from the what in the UN is called the WEOG, the Western Europe and Others group, which is not great. We need to see more women across the board. I am very conscious that women from traditional societies are often even more constrained at pursuing opportunities than women from those societies which now embrace proactively the idea of gender equality. We've learned a tremendous amount over COVID about the challenges posed to women in the working environment when they are required to continue to have a disproportionate responsibility for familial labor, for the domestic responsibility, for the emotional labor of a home. And that can be compounded in traditional societies where it is not acceptable necessarily for, in the Pakistan case, for a woman to tell her in-laws, no, I can't do that for you right now because I have a job. And we found at COVID when people went home and they were trying to work remotely, that the women were having much more difficulty in a work environment in which they were trying to share space with their domestic environment than men did in a similar circumstance. So I think the most important thing is that we look across the board at these issues.
Thank you. Cynthia, there's a question about what the universities can do, particularly a university like Georgetown that excels in study of international diplomacy. What can universities do to become better pipelines for women leaders in the field of diplomacy?
I have to honestly say, from my perspective at Georgetown, I'm not sure there's a whole lot more they can do. I have many female students who are in the Foreign Service. I see absolutely no difference. There's certainly no difference in how they're treated at Georgetown, and their success in entering the Foreign Service. Perhaps more can be done to maybe prepare them and kind of arm them for what they may encounter. And there can always be, I think, more mentoring. And I think that is always great. I hadn't really thought of this, Mehran, so thanks for the question. Thanks for whoever asked it. I stay in touch with quite a number of my students. That's one of the great gifts of teaching, is you get to have these fantastic young people in your life. Even though you keep getting older, you keep having young people. It's really great. But I'm just thinking, when you say that, what Georgetown could possibly do is to make more of an effort with its own graduates in the Foreign Service to have mentoring sessions and bring some of the senior ones together with the junior ones, because of course they're all dispersed all over the place, but a conscious effort to do that could really be beneficial. I actually have at this moment in the Bahamas, nice place to visit, 2 former students, one who's the boss of the other one. They're both women. But I think there is more the university could do in terms of mentoring. At the university, I think we're pretty good, but we could make more of an effort in terms of mentoring.
Our time is just about up, but I don't want to chicken out. There's a question for me from the audience. It says, question for Mehran Kamrava. How have you seen gender in diplomacy practice develop or progress in Qatar? I first moved to Qatar in 2007, and when I first came here, the one female who was active in diplomacy that I knew of was Sheikha Mosa, the wife of the father emir, who at the time was the official consort of the emir. And Sheikha Mosa, of course, is responsible for us being here and the driving force and the visionary that brought American universities here, Georgetown here, and others. And then over the course of the last 17 years, I have seen steadily a greater and greater number of really amazing and brilliant Qatari women rise to the fore. Of course, they had been there when I first came, but I didn't know them. And the more I got to know this society, and the more I got to study and learn about Qatar, and kind of immerse myself in the environment, I discovered that there is a really concerted effort being made by women themselves, not interestingly, by women themselves, to not only excel in positions of leadership and to achieve positions of leadership, but in daily life and as they navigate their careers and their professions. We know, for example, that some 75% or 80% of Qatar University is female. An overwhelming proportion of our own students are female, and they're brilliant. And so as they enter the workforce from Qatar University, from other outfits, from Education City, as they progress through their professions, I've been here long enough to kind of follow, like you do, some of their careers, and they have now achieved tremendous position. And so the progress is absolutely remarkable and something to be emulated, quite frankly, by many of the other regional states. So on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists.